Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to ask those of you seated at the back if you could come up to the front, or when you're finished anyway, move up to the front. It gives the kind of more sense of having a conversation with people than having people spread back there. I know you're trying to eat, but as you finish, if you could come forward, that would be great. We would really appreciate it. And the guards who will be moving everyone forward then won't have to do their job. My name is John Carson, and I'm the director of the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies. We are pleased to be partnering with the University of Michigan's Inclusive History Project to bring you today's symposium, Confronting an Institution's Pasts. We're so glad to see so many of you here in person, and we welcome as well our very large virtual audience participating over Zoom. It is particularly apt to open our proceedings with an acknowledgement of how we all came to be in this place. Over 205 years ago, a treaty was signed between Michigan's territorial governor, Lewis Cass, and the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Wendat, whose ancestral lands included most of what is now Michigan's Lower Peninsula. In the treaty process, 1,920 acres of land were granted by these Native peoples for a college at Detroit, in which Native peoples would be eligible to enroll. To what degree it was a gift freely given or one coerced is still debated, but it constitutes the founding bequest for what became the University of Michigan. We include this acknowledgement in part as a reminder of the deep roots and long-lasting implications of the stories we will explore today. They are part of an ongoing legacy. Before I turn to introducing our speakers, I have three quick logistical notes. First, those in person here today can access cart captions at the website provided on the slide behind me, either by following the QR code, sorry, it's suddenly now very loud, or the shortened link. The link was also sent to you in your registration reminder email earlier this week. Second, we are recording the event, and the recording will be sent to all registrants and audience members in person and virtually. And third, we invite everyone present to get up and move around as needed during the next 2 hours. The food and drink will be in place until at least 1:30. Now for our speakers and moderators. Kacie Butcher is an award-winning public historian whose work is dedicated to building empathy and advancing social justice. She is currently the director of the UW-Madison Public History Project, a multi-year effort to uncover and give voice to the histories of discrimination, exclusion, and resistance on campus. The project culminated in the Sifting and Reckoning physical and digital exhibitions, public lectures, curricular materials, and more that gives space for the Madison community to reckon with this history. She is active in the public history community and is the co-chair of the membership committee for the National Council on Public History. James Campbell is the Edgar E. Robinson Professor of History at Stanford University. His publications include Middle Passages, African American Journeys to Africa, 1787 to 2005, Slavery and the University, Histories and Legacies, and Mississippi Witness, The Photographs of Florence Mars. He is currently completing a book on the Mississippi Freedom Movement in history and memory. A committed public historian, Campbell has served as an historical consultant for numerous curricular projects, documentary films, and museum exhibitions, including the Power of Place exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Formerly a professor of American Civilization, Africana Studies, and History at Brown, he chaired the Brown University Steering Committee on Slavery and Justice. Evelyn Hammonds is the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of the History of Science, Professor of African and African American Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Professor of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. I have no idea how she keeps track of all of her offices, but clearly, as we know, she's a very gifted person and so can manage it. Her research focuses on the history of scientific, medical, and sociopolitical concepts of race, gender, and sexuality in the histories of medicine, science, and public health in the United States. At Harvard, she served on the President's Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery and the Faculty Executive Committee of the Peabody Museum, and she chaired the university-wide Steering Committee on Human Relations in the Harvard Museum collections. Professor Hammonds is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is the current Vice President-elect of the History of Science Society. Kurt von Dacke, did I get that right, Kurt? Close enough, sorry, I'm not the best at these. I apologize. Is Assistant Dean and Professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia. A historian, he leads the UVA's President's Commissions on Slavery and on the University in the Age of Segregation, manages the university's Studying Slavery Consortium, and directs UVA's Gibbons Project. His publications include Freedom Has a Face, Race, Identity, and Community in Jefferson's Virginia, the President's Commission on Slavery and the University 2018 report, Essays in Educated in Tyranny, Slavery at Thomas Jefferson's University, and the forthcoming After Emancipation, A History of Race, Community, and the University of Virginia. Elizabeth Cole is University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor of Psychology, Women's and Gender Studies, and Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. She too must have many offices. She earned her doctorate at the University of Michigan in personality psychology and taught at Northeastern University before joining UM in 2000. Her research has been published in journals in psychology and women's studies, including American Psychologist, Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, and Psychology of Women Quarterly. She is past president and fellow of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues and a consulting editor for American Psychologist. She has received the Committee on Women in Psychology Leadership Award from the American Psychological Association and both the Harold R. Johnson Diversity Service Award and the Sarah Goddard Power Award from the University of Michigan. Dr. Cole has served as the Associate Dean for Social Sciences and the Interim Dean of the College of Literature, Science and the Arts, and is currently the Director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity. She is also serving as co-chair of the Framing and Design Committee of the Inclusive History Project. Earl Lewis is the founding director of the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions and the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, Afro-American and African Studies, and Public Policy here at the University of Michigan. He is President Emeritus of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also co-chair of the Framing and Design Committee of the Inclusive History Project. This is quite an illustrious panel. We are so lucky to have them here. The Eisenberg Institute is particularly happy to be one of the hosts for this event. The Eisenberg seeks to enhance conversations about and around history, both within the history department and throughout the university. Today's symposium fits well with our two-year theme, Against History, which aims to unpack the divergent meanings and practices of history, as well as the dangers of attempts to whitewash the complexities that the past has to offer. With that, I'll turn the proceedings over to Earl Lewis and Liz Cole, who will tell us a bit about the Inclusive History Project. Earl and Liz, it's yours.
So good afternoon. Thank you for being with us here today. And I would like to start us off by telling you a little bit about the Inclusive History Project here at Michigan. The Inclusive History Project was announced as a presidential initiative in June 2022, and it's charged with studying, documenting, and telling a comprehensive history of the University of Michigan, one that is attentive to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and stretches across the university's 3 campuses. In leading our community to deeper knowledge of our shared past, the IHP aims to increase understanding of our present and to move us toward a more inclusive and equitable future. The IHP is in the middle year of a framing and design process in which a really fantastic committee of faculty, staff, and students drawn from all three of U of M's campuses are thoughtfully considering the work that lies ahead and making a plan for accomplishing it. And I'm really delighted to be co-chairing that committee with Earl. Among ourselves, we've been calling this year, this planning year, Year Zero. And our goals for Year Zero include taking stock of where the university is in regards to what is broadly and less broadly known about its past, about the stories that are told about our institutional history on our campuses, in our classrooms and libraries, and through tours and building names. We're surveying archives and collections for future researchers, planning for curriculum and pedagogy, and considering memorialization practices. And we're working on articulating a vision and making a multi-year plan for the work that lies ahead. What we know already is that to tell a comprehensive history of this big, complex university, of its students and staff, faculty and patients, players and coaches, fans of Dearborn, Flint, and Ann Arbor, and of the state of Michigan, of this institution's national and global reach will take time. To tell an inclusive history of this university with consideration of race and racism, gender and sexuality, socioeconomic status, religious identification, international status, ability and disability and status, and more, that will take time, but we believe it's worth taking that time. At the same time, we plan to balance patience with urgency and process with product, and develop timetables and plans that maintain a sense of momentum, but also allow us to share our progress and engage our communities as we move through a multi-year project. We also believe that the process of this project will itself have an impact in how and where it focuses our attention and the way it supports and extends the continued emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion that's continuing to become a part of our institution. We also know that this project is entering a landscape where a lot of work has already been done on this university's history, and even more particularly on this university's inclusive history. And this work is taking place in so many places, in our campuses, in our libraries, in classes offered by our departments, through exhibits and lectures that attended the university's bicentennial, as well as other important anniversaries that are celebrated by departments, schools, and campuses, and in partnership with our local communities. I was going to name some of these efforts, but there are really just too many wonderful ones, and our committee's at work to still identify more. Our ambition is to find ways to stretch across these existing efforts, to collect and catalog them, and to partner with them when we can to bring them forward to new audiences. In true U of M fashion, and like this past work, we imagine that some elements of our future work over the next 5 years will be decentralized, so there will be room for individuals to pursue efforts under the Inclusive History Project's umbrella. And so all of this is to say that we're aiming to amplify the work that's ongoing and to support new work that's being dreamed up by members of our community. I hope you are getting just a little sense of the ambition of this project. We've been charged to tell a comprehensive and inclusive history, and we intend for that new history to be part and parcel of the stories we tell about this place. We aim for a university community that is instructed by a deep understanding of its past to produce material change on our campuses. In these efforts, it's essential that we hear from and learn from our communities. And so another essential part of our project is outreach. And there will be opportunities that we can hear from community members from across the 3 campuses and what they want from this project and what needs it should address. We will be publicizing these opportunities broadly, and we hope that you will all participate. But today, in the next couple hours, we have a crucial opportunity to learn from institutional history projects that have been undertaken by other universities. And that ranges from the foundational work that was done at Brown University on slavery and justice to projects that are continuing right up until the present, with ongoing research and implementation efforts at the University of Virginia, at Harvard University, and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So to tell you a little bit about that, we've asked our 4 speakers to begin today by providing a brief overview of their projects that include the project's origins and goals. And we'll proceed through those remarks roughly in chronological order of when those projects were started. So we will begin with Jim Campbell, who will tell us about the projects at Brown.
Thank you so much for having me. Many of the most gracious things that have ever happened to me in my life happened as a result of the project that President Ruth Simmons started at Brown University, and being here with you today is one of them. To understand the origins of the Brown Project, it's useful to go back to the early years of this century. And some of you will remember one of the most volatile political issues debated at that time was the issue of slavery reparations, an issue that had come to the boil both because of the submission by Congressman John Conyers of Michigan of so-called H.R. 40, a bill that never got out of the Justice Department, but that would have commissioned a study about the legacy of slavery and recommendations that might be, remedies that might be considered. And also the filing of a series of class action lawsuits by descendants of African-American enslaved people seeking damages from private corporations alleged to have participated in and profited from slave-related industries. Now those lawsuits, H.R. 40 has never been enacted. Those lawsuits were very unsuccessful. They were consolidated and heard in the Northern District of Illinois Federal Court in 2004 and pretty much dismissed entirely. But they did give rise to an extraordinarily vociferous political debate. In fact, a series of public opinion polls that were done at that time found the issue of slavery reparations the most divisive racial issue ever surveyed. There were 3 different studies that were done, all of which produced quite similar results, finding that depending on how you asked the question, something below or above half of African Americans believed that they were entitled to some redress in light of the 2.5 centuries of unrequited toil of their ancestors. But when you put the same question to white Americans, 95 to 96% said no. I mean, think about American politics, and it wasn't a heck of a lot less polarized in the early 2000s than it is now. Think about an issue in which 95% of white Americans would be in agreement. Now that issue came to a point at Brown University, in part because a reparations coordinating committee had identified Brown as well as Harvard and Yale as probable targets of litigation. Those lawsuits, in fact, were never filed. The other thing, however, that brought the issue home at Brown was the publication in the Brown Daily Herald, as well as in several other student newspapers around the country, of a paid political advertisement written by a conservative journalist and activist named David Horowitz. It was entitled 10 Reasons Why Reparations for Slavery is a Bad Idea and Racist Too. I think it does no disservice to Mr. Horowitz, who has sort of made a career out of challenging what we would now call the woke politics of college campuses, to say that the ad was placed in college newspapers deliberately to provoke a reaction. The 10 reasons offered a kind of escalating series of claims about why reparations were a bad idea, that Black Americans were in fact vastly better off by virtue of the fact that their ancestors had been enslaved rather than left behind in Africa, that reparations had already been paid in the form of welfare and other social programs, that Black Americans were ungrateful to the white Christians who had courageously freed them, and that any remaining disparities that existed between Black and white people in the United States had nothing to do with an institution that had been abolished hundreds of years before, but instead reflected Black Americans' own individual failures of character. Well, if indeed the goal of the advertisement was to provoke responses demonstrating the intolerance of conservative opinion on college campuses, well, Mr. Horowitz hit the jackpot at Brown University, where a group of students came together calling themselves, not very creatively, the Union of Concerned Brown Students, and demanded that the Brown Daily Herald retract the ad and relinquish, I think, the $75 that had been paid for it. When the editors refused, those students tried physically to intimidate the editors and then announced that they would not allow the newspaper to be circulated until the editors met their demands. Now, I don't know if you can steal something that's free, but the next day when the Brown Daily Herald was distributed at its various distribution points, groups of students made off with an entire day's press run of the paper. A day later, Brown was on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, the London Times, Fox News, MSNBC. And you can imagine the tenor of the coverage, essentially suggesting, I think as Mr. Horowitz hoped to demonstrate, that this institution was so kind of politically correct that the only response of students when confronted with ideas that challenged their presuppositions was to smash the presses. It was not a very good day for the university. Now, as it happens, Brown had a short time before appointed a new president, Ruth Simmons, who on her accession to the presidency the following fall would become the first Black woman, indeed the first African American, to preside over an Ivy League university. Given her own status as a granddaughter of enslaved people, given the kind of publicity and the lingering animosity from the episode about the papers, one would have imagined that President Simmons, and we have two people on this panel who count her as our mentor and adore her. One might have imagined that President Simmons would give the issue of slavery and reparations a very, very wide berth. And she chose to do exactly the opposite. In her first official speech at Brown Convocation in the fall of 2001, you can find this online, I commend it to you. It's the most remarkable academic speech I've ever heard. She took as her subject to the incoming freshmen, the subject of what had happened the previous spring. Now, Brown has a tradition, as universities like this one do too, I'm sure. There's a gate onto the main quad that only opens twice. It opens inward on convocation when the freshman class processes inward. It opens outward 4 years later when they graduate. And she basically said to the students, she said, look, if you think you have come here to be shielded from ideas that make you uncomfortable, please get up and leave now. We haven't shut the gates yet. She said, but I hope you won't. I hope you will stay and join the community of loving combat that is a university. She then, a short time later, did something even more extraordinary. She appointed a committee of faculty, staff, and students and charged it to investigate Brown's and publicly disclose the facts of Brown University's historical relationships to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Moreover, asked us to organize public programs that would help our students and the nation think in reasoned, rigorous ways about the complex legal, ethical, political, and moral questions that were raised by the slavery reparations issue, suggesting that Brown, by virtue of its history, had a particular opportunity and obligation to provide leadership. That experience, and again, you can simply find online the Brown University Slavery and Justice Report. You'll find also a great deal of information about the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, which is one of the legacies of that work. I'll say no more about it except for one other thing that President Simmons said to me quite early in this process. We had a planning meeting, and she looked at me and she said, if I were you, I would start thinking right now about what you're going to say to other universities, because if you don't screw this up, they're going to call you. And 20 years later, I have had the opportunity to speak at literally dozens of other universities about that experience and have been enormously gratified by the fact that there are now today over 100 universities that are members of the consortium of universities studying slavery that is run out of Professor Vandaka's office. I think what Ruth Simmons taught me was that this is not an odd or anomalous thing for a university to do, that doing this kind of work is in the finest tradition of what a university is. And I commend you all at Michigan for embarking on a very similar journey. Thank you.
I think the perfect handoff to me at the University of Virginia, because when we formed our working group to start this work in 2013, one of the first calls we placed was to Professor Campbell to learn about the work at Brown. Our project launched in 2013, but it was built on the shoulders of give or take a decade of on and off student research projects and actual student agitation around you need to tell a different story, right? If you've been to Charlottesville or to the University of Virginia, it's known as Mr. Jefferson's University, and we rather uncritically imagine Mr. Jefferson as only responsible for the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, the Declaration of Independence, and literally founding and building the University of Virginia. We even had a sign on a garden wall that claimed he built those brick walls that stood until 2021. So it was this really important student work and energy that got people to start paying attention. And the energy started in 2007. This was the 400-year anniversary of the founding of Virginia as a political entity. And in the first awkward moment of acknowledgement, our General Assembly had the wisdom to go, we have to at least mention slavery. And so they issued a statement of profound regret for human bondage in Virginia's history. Our Board of Visitors followed suit a couple weeks later. Great. This was a really good start. And then and I think this is very familiar to what old universities do, they patted themselves on the back and said, we need a plaque. And so they put a plaque in. This plaque is embedded in the ground. So, not the place you put a plaque you want people to see. Worse yet, it's in an underground walkway of the Rotunda, which is our temple to knowledge in the central building on our campus. And even worse, it's the threshold to an archway in this outdoor hallway. So you have to stop perpendicular to traffic, look down and read small print. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but it acknowledged the several hundred free and enslaved laborers who helped build the university from 1817 to 1826, thus realizing Mr. Jefferson's vision for the university. Students walked over it and I think, nearly had a heart attack. They couldn't believe this is what it said, right? It was, again, it's a moment of acknowledgement. It's really important. But that plaque rightly angered them, right? That it, one, commingles free and enslaved laborers as if they're somehow equal in the building of the university. They weren't. It only acknowledges slavery during the era of construction, not the next 4 decades before the general emancipation. And then it somehow makes this a tribute to Thomas Jefferson, a man who enslaved 607 people over the course of his life. So our students did something really interesting. Their version of protest was to form an independent student organization and launch kind of awareness-raising activities. What are the things we can do to get people to talk about this and look at the landscape here differently and think about who we're not honoring? And this culminated in a 2011 design competition for a memorial, not a memorial that was ever going to be built. It was really about, let's get people's creative juices flowing and think about how we might reimagine our landscape. Really key work in leading President Teresa Sullivan in 2013 to form the commission. It was that student energy, particularly after 2007, that also spurred an alumni group to put their money on the line and create an endowed fund specifically for inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And so it was those two pieces that drove President Sullivan to form our commission in 2013. We had a very simple charge. Go do the research, right? Up to this point, there have been important but small student projects kind of cherry picking the entire pieces of the archive and getting at the story. Do the full story. Let's understand the history of slavery at the university. Maybe we can identify and tell the stories of enslaved people. We were told we should do something educational, put on a conference, put on a symposium, work with the rotunda, which was under renovation at that point, to include a new visitor center that actually talked about slavery. It's a one-room museum. And then to consider appropriate memorialization. So that was our simple charge as we started. We were a large commission, about 27 people, and we spent 9 months arguing about what does this mean and what are we going to do? And I think what's really interesting about our work is we decided in those 9 months, so again, heated exchanges. Do we start with the living wage? Where do we start this work? And the decision was no, let's understand the history and let's connect that history to the present. That's the thing we can do. That slavery ended in 1865, but its afterlives live with us to this day. So our goal in doing the work was to, again, complete the report, connect it to the present, and do it with the community. And when I say the community, it's a vague anyone and everyone, students, staff, faculty, and people who lived in the surrounding counties around us, that our story was inseparable from those communities. So I think the key piece of our goal was to engage with the community and make decisions about what we did based on those conversations. And this is hard. You're all at university. You're here at University of Michigan. I don't know the context of how you get along with residents in Ann Arbor, but they're often fraught, right? Universities imagine themselves as good neighbors, but often, even in their well-meaning moments, are really kind of abusive of the communities around them. And this was much the case in Charlottesville. To add to that, right, probably many faculty in the room here, all of us, we're experts. What do we do when we talk about the things we know a lot about? We lecture. We don't listen. And so I think the key piece of our work was we're going to go out into the community and we're going to listen. And this is important because 9 months in, we held our first community engagement meeting. We invited people to come to a community center. So not at the university. We went out into the town. We served lunch. We sat people at round tables and we literally asked them, here's our charge. What does it mean and what would success look like? And we had them talk amongst themselves and then report out. The first person who stood up to report out said, you better damn well build a memorial. It better be big, it better be visible, and we better be able to get to it. So we knew we couldn't consider appropriate memorialization. So in March 2014, the goal was build an actual memorial. The second person that stood up openly wept about being evicted from his family's house when he was young in the 1980s as part of the university just quietly gobbling up a neighborhood to then evict the remaining renters, bulldoze the neighborhood, and build the university hospital. And so this spoke, we were already intuitively on, we need to create the legacies, but we knew out of those two moments, we had to connect the dots to the present. And I think in terms of high-level production, where we ended up, it's building the memorial. If you have a chance to come to Charlottesville, please come visit it. It's a project that's built by not just the university, but with the community as co-creators of the final project. And we worked in all of that, and this is, I think, really important in this work. It's very easy for a committee to produce a report, do this work, and then you produce a glossy report, everyone pats themselves on the back, and then the reports gather dust in people's offices. So we looked to make changes to the built landscape at the University of Virginia so that the only stories you received when you arrived there weren't just about Thomas Jefferson and the Enlightenment University. These other stories would become obvious. So we worked really hard to make changes to the built landscape. And I hope we have time to talk about that more later. I think we were reasonably successful in those engaged activities and working on how to create cultural change, right? Our student body didn't know this history. How do we, and you all know at a university, every 2 years, right, half your student body's gone. So you have to start the work all over again. So working on ways to make the education kind of continuous and make everyone look at the landscape differently and understand the story, not when they took a class in their third or fourth year, but sort of from the minute they walked on campus. So thank you.
Are we going chronologically?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm next. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here this afternoon to share some of what we've learned in our project at Harvard. And just to give you an overview of the timeline, as Jim said, first and foremost, we were completely inspired by the work of Ruth Simmons and Jim at Brown. Ruth is very close to Harvard. Her PhD is from Harvard. She's very committed to the university and had a major impact on why we began to consider this project. So in 2016, then President Drew Faust, who, as many of you know, is an eminent Civil War historian, was interested in one of our classes, which was taught also by eminent historian Sven Beckert, on Harvard and slavery. And the undergraduates who took that class had done a number of projects and began to uncover some history that had seemingly been lost or under analyzed. And Sven went to her and asked for support for the projects that his students were working on. As a result of that work, the first thing that came to visibility was the fact that there have been 4 enslaved peoples who had served early Harvard presidents and lived in Wadsworth House on campus. And that was a big surprise to many people, because most people, including the ones in Massachusetts, think, why would we be interested in this issue about, the impact of slavery? We are in Massachusetts, hotbed of abolitionism in the North. There's no problem here, or very little, that we need to be concerned about. And of course, those kind of general stereotypes about Massachusetts history were not true. And so for President Faust, it was really important to begin to focus on what actually we knew about the history of Harvard and its impact with relationship to slavery. Following the identification of the 4 enslaved peoples who had worked on campus, President Faust ordered the production of a very nice plaque that's on Wadsworth House, and opened it with the ceremony of which former Congressman John Lewis attended to place the plaque on the building. Following that, Elizabeth Cohen, who's also an American historian, held a conference at Radcliffe, which bring together many other universities who had started working on these projects. And Jim was one of the people who spoke at that meeting, and also Ruth Simmons was present. And so for a couple of years, we were interested in just sort of supporting existing efforts by undergraduate students, some graduate students, to look at that history, but not in really putting a lot of emphasis on it. Then one thing I think sort of changed that post the conference that was held in 2017 under the auspices of Radcliffe was that there was also research being done at Harvard Law School. So Harvard Law School's dean was always known up until that time as the royal family dean of Harvard Law School. And the royal family, turns out, was one of the earliest and largest benefactors of Harvard Law School, but they also had a very large plantation in Antigua, and it was known to be a very infamous plantation. And that is where a lot of that money for the endowment of Harvard Law School came from. At the time, Elena Kagan was dean of Harvard Law School, and I can't even tell you how fast the seal that was brought down came down, because the Harvard Law School crest also was embedded in it, the royal family crest. So that brought a great attention to the notion that, wait, we need to stop and examine this belief that Harvard did not have much to do with slavery. And so that spurred other efforts. And then in 2019, when President Bacow when Larry Bacow became president of Harvard, he wanted to follow up with this work. He established a new presidential commission, picked a number of prominent faculty as well as other folks around the university to come together to go more deeply into our history as a university and its relationship to the present, to understand and unpack the impact of slavery. And so that work, as I said, began in 2019. And one of the first things that we discovered as that committee was put together was also to do a survey of our museum collections, particularly the Peabody Museum of Ethnology and Anthropology, and also the Warren Anatomical Museums over at Harvard Medical School. Upon doing that survey, what was found is that we had at least 19 human remains of individuals who were enslaved at the time they came into our collections. And we also had to acknowledge we had almost at that point 7,000 remains of indigenous peoples from around the world. So putting together the survey from our museums, not all of our museums, but some specific museums on campus, was also a part and parcel. That was one of the impetus for bringing together this presidential committee to look at the history of Harvard and its relationship to slavery. So in 2022, the final report came out, and we held a conference. The report is now a book that you can buy from Harvard University Press. And we have an implementation plan of the recommendations of the committee. And I think one of the more important issues that we were aware of and focused on as we did our work as a committee is that we knew that it was going to take time to really delve deeply into this history. Secondly, that it was not only going to take time, it was going to need resources. And so upon the announcement of the report, the Harvard Corporation and President Bacow committed $100 million to an endowment that will support the efforts and the recommendations and the implementation of the recommendations of this committee going forward. Much of those recommendations are still being worked on, and we're working out the details. We do have an implementation committee and an office that's been staffed. We are also now busy doing some of the work that President Bacow was very, very deeply committed to. That first, our own community had to come to terms and understand this history. So what we've been doing over the since 2021 through 2022 is spending a lot of times having convenings with our own faculty. So, and especially this month, we have a number of convenings because of Black History Month. We also have the first group of senior faculty who are working with graduate students in our Teaching and Learning Center to develop new curricula that would include a lot of the historical work that has been done, but really lay out the plans for what needs to be done in terms of that work. And we are meeting with many members of our community to actually make sure that the community is informed about what is actually in the report, what the recommendations are, and what our plans are for moving forward. One of the things that I think will take more time, but is really how we engage more of the local communities in the Boston area in understanding this work and figuring out exactly what kinds of work we will continue to do, with those communities. Another important recommendation was that Harvard engage in some serious, robust collaborations with HBCUs. We'll be getting that work as well. And we are really focused on, cultural and institutional change. And then I think one last piece is that we recognize that there needs to be some kind of appropriate memorialization. And we are working on that as well in terms of identifying space or spaces that we can use to allow the communities, internal community to the university and external communities to be apprised of that history. And then I think one of the other things that is very important to us with respect to the memorialization, that it will also include in some way, soon to be determined, recognition of the human remains that we have in our care. So we will be working on those very steadily right now. And I think that it has been one of the most significant university-wide efforts at Harvard in a very, very long time. It's very important to President Bacow and to members of the committee that this be buy-in from the entire community. From every single dean was asked to review the draft of the report and provide their own commentary. And it was not going to go forward until that was addressed, their issues were addressed. And now we're spending time in various schools, having convenings much like this, going through those recommendations and making sure people in our community understand what we intend to do moving forward. And we will certainly be involving students, staff, faculty, everybody involved in our community. And I hope also robust consultation with communities outside of Harvard as well. So I think I will stop there. It has been a tremendous effort on the part of members of the community. Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin has done a magnificent job in pulling this all together. Our website, I think, has gotten much more robust. There's a small film on it. There are other documentations of the projects that are ongoing and that began as a result of this effort. So we've not been at this as long as Jim has or as Kurt has, but we feel that we are at the end of the beginning and that we're moving forward in ways that will make the institution better, and that we will be much more aware and I would say committed to understanding our past and how it shapes the future.
And we would be then the newest kids on the block. So UW-Madison's Public History Project came out really of the violence in Charlottesville in 2017. So following that violence in Charlottesville, Chancellor Rebecca Blank commissioned a committee of historians and community members to study two student groups on UW-Madison's campus from the 1920s that bore the name of the Ku Klux Klan. This was a well-known secret for over 50 years, and it had already been published on, but the Chancellor commissioned this committee to kind of give an official report to the university. In that report, the group really sidestepped the naming question, which was one of the kind of main questions of the research, and instead said, by focusing so closely on these two student organizations from the 1920s, what are all of the other histories of discrimination that we're missing on campus, but also what are the histories of resistance that we're missing on campus? And so we started in 2019. We were given $1 million for 3 years. We had to expand the project to 4 years because of the pandemic. We couldn't access the archives for 6 months, and so that posed quite a research challenge for us. But there's two things I think that we talk about that make our project really unique. The first is the scale and the scope of our research question. So unlike the other panelists, UW-Madison does not have a direct connection to slavery in the same way. We've researched that question. We've looked, of course, like every university, every community has a connection to slavery, but we don't have the same direct connection. So none of our early funders were slave owners. We don't have the money connections that we thought we might find. So instead, we took a really broad look at our research. So we look at discrimination writ large across the entire history of the university. We looked at 175 years plus the 10,000-year history of Dejo about the Ho-Chunk community that was originally in Madison. So we look at discrimination against racial and ethnic groups, discrimination against LGBTQ folks with disabilities, religious discrimination, gender discrimination. We definitely think of our project as a mile wide, not a mile deep. And we were very, very clear with community that this was just the first pass, that we were really just scratching the surface on the types of stories that we could tell. And it was important for us to have this diversity of research because the stories we often tell about our institutions are very narrow, and we wanted people to see themselves as a part of history, to see their communities reflected across time as a part of the canon of our university history. The second thing that was really unique is from the beginning, we took a public history approach. So I'm a public historian, and we decided from the outset that we were not going to focus on academic products. So we are not publishing a book. We're not publishing a historical reports. Instead, we did a physical exhibit. So we had a 3,300 square foot exhibit at the main art museum on campus. It was kind of a unique partnership. They had never done a history exhibit before. So we had the physical exhibit. The physical exhibit closed in December. All of the exhibit is still available online at reckoning.wisc.edu. Everything in the physical exhibit plus more is on the website. It also includes newly digitized materials from our archives, blog posts, full source citations. So it's a really rich kind of way to keep the findings of the exhibit available. We also created a suite of curricular and teaching guides so that we could get this into the classroom. We had a very robust event and lecture series. So we were really thinking about how we could get the research that we were doing out into the community to have a conversation. And the reason I think we took that framing is because from the outset, the reason that Chancellor Rebecca Blank committed money to this and was really inspired to do this was that UW has a culture problem. It's going to be a similar problem that every university has. Michigan probably has similar cultural issues that we have. And I think she was frustrated that, we have a diversity office, we have initiatives, we're doing scholarship programs, we're diversifying faculty and staff, we're diversifying the student body, and yet these cultural problems persist. So why don't we try something new? Maybe the history is the tool. Maybe it is a key that we can open up different conversations. And so we wanted, with that kind of impetus, with that motivation, we thought about how do we start those conversations? And so as a team, we've really tried to think creatively about how to access different groups of people on campus and community with, how do they see this history as interesting to them, as useful to them, as something that they actually want to engage with. And the community, because of that, has been deeply embedded in every step of the work. So I often feel lucky to be the person who gets to come to these rooms and brag about the project. But really, I have a really wonderful staff, and we've had hundreds of students and community members and faculty and staff and alumni who showed up for us and who helped with research, who spread the word, who donated money, who invited us to come on their, radio shows, who really helped spread this far and wide. And it's because of that the project began as a temporary initiative. So we had 4 years, $1 million. Our new chancellor, Jennifer Mnuchin, just announced that she will be permanently continuing the project, and we will be opening the Rebecca M. Blank Center for Campus History. So we will get to continue to do this work for generations to come. And we're really excited about the types of cultural change that might be able to affect on campus, because we will still be here to do research, to be in classrooms, to have these difficult conversations.
Thank you all. That was great and a nice introduction to the topic before us. I should say two things. One, we're going to have a conversation in two parts. We'll start the conversation here, and Liz and I will ask a handful of questions, and then we will open it up to you here in the audience, in person, as well as online. And so at some point, we will flag and invite you to come to the standing mics to ask any question. But let me start with a question, and I guess we are also being instructed to bring the mics just a little bit closer for the feeds, both on in person, but particularly online. So I should say to this audience and to the audience online, the Framing and Design Committee has already started a conversation with our colleagues earlier today, and so some of the questions will follow on to those questions that were already posed. But let me throw out the first one. As you think back to the start of your projects and think about what you imagined you were going to be working on and doing at the outset, what you actually ended up working on, and the things you learned along the way. I mean, there are ways, how accurate were you in predicting what would work and what wouldn't work? What other things sort of came into the fore as you moved along the process? And so anyone want to jump in, or I can call?
Go ahead.
Kirk,
Sure. I will jump in. Oh, this is a tough question. I think we rightly anticipated that the story couldn't end with slavery. And I didn't mention this in my initial comments. Because of the work about talking about it as slavery and its legacies for 3 years, we were already in 2017 in conversations with both then President Teresa Sullivan and incoming President Jim Campbell I just made you president of the University of Virginia.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Sorry, Jim Ryan, excuse me. about we need to continue this. So there needs to be a successor commission. This was a decision beyond my full control, but we were going to look at the next 100 years, and we framed that as the age of segregation. So we were already looking at the next 100 years, and you all know, Kacie, you mentioned this in your opening comments, August 11th and 12th happened in Charlottesville. So I think the thing I didn't anticipate was that Charlottesville was going to become the site, it really started in 2016, of not only white supremacist demonstrations, but white supremacist violence that overtook the city and the university for 2 days. I think that dramatically changed what we were going to do. We had anticipated going in, and rightly, as a historian, you kind of know the only story in here isn't one about slavery or about, racism and Reconstruction in the age of segregation. There are going to be a whole lot of other stories. We knew that there was a running story about patriarchy and misogyny that's interrelated with these racist questions about racism. We knew there was anti-Asian and Asian American discrimination at the university. We knew about anti-Semitic discrimination. So we were anticipating we were going to have to go in all those directions as we went on. And what we, again, couldn't anticipate is August 11th and 12th, which I think just rocked the boat. And when that commission was impaneled, the decision was very clearly, no, the thing we have to fully unpack first is the university's and the community's long history of anti-Black racism. We were actually asked at the first meeting, would you consider telling other stories? And 35 people looked very angry and said no. So I couldn't have anticipated that any of that would have happened. And I think this is a good reminder, and everyone here will share stories about this. These projects tend to balloon and go in directions you can't fully anticipate, and also tend to take on a little bit of a life of their own. And so you have to be prepared for it's going to take longer to do the work than you think it is, and certainly longer than the university may have asked you to do it for. I think as well, we in those first several months, and I said this earlier, right, wanted to make this a shared community project. The second commission that's looking at the next 100 years, I co-chair it with the person who directs a community organization. So it's literally with a foot planted in the community. It's not just our story to tell. So we were right about that. We prepared for it. And it was a good decision. The connecting to the past to the present, again, we were right about that in 2013. We wouldn't realize that we were going to become a hashtag in 2017 when the present happened in the way it did in Charlottesville. And I think we were also right about the importance of making permanent changes to the built landscape so that when you're done, it's just not a report collecting dust. And then the last two things, everybody here will talk about educating students, right? We built a curriculum. So we have 2 classes that run in American Studies that look at the entire university's history, particularly around these questions of racism and discrimination. There's a senior seminar, we call it a pavilion seminar, that students can come back and do a longer research project on. I run a summer camp that we created in 2016 where we bring in high school students from all across the country, and literally they roll up their sleeves, they do an archaeological dig, they go into the archives, they meet with the community, and we use UVA and Central Virginia as a case study for this work. And what's really cool about this is those students, every one of them, most of them do it because the admissions office sends out a blast about the camp, and their parents go, oh, you should go there. It's going to help you get into UVA. I doubt we help anybody get into UVA. It'd be nice if we did. But what's interesting is they all come, and we ask them at the end of the camp interview, why did you come? My parents made me is often the answer. And then they say, what do you think about UVA now? And the answer is universally every year, any place that would be this open about its own past and talk about it and put us in front of the community. And we just let the community, we don't mediate that conversation, is a place I want to go. They all come to UVA. So it's really neat. They come in already knowing this history and looking at the landscape differently. We don't have to wait for that moment to happen in the brief 4 years we have them. And finally, the last thing, I don't know that we knew how good this was going to be, but we knew from those first several months when we created an advisory board Again, for people from Brown, Emory, William and Mary had a project going as well. And then there were a abortive attempts at a project at the University of Alabama. And we brought the folks in who had attempted to get a project launched there to get advice from them. And in those conversations, we realized, oh, the problem up to 2013 was everybody was doing this in a silo. There would be protests at a university, there'd be some activity that created the commission, and they would maybe find the Brown report, but work silently and not talk to one another. And we started to think about what's going to be the thing that lives on beyond our work here that moves the needle from where Brown and Ruth Simmons, right, the gold standard, set this. And we thought, if we can leave it that when we're done, everybody's doing this. This is a really good thing. So we created in 2015, had a terrible acronym, Virginia Colleges and Universities Studying Slavery, VCUS for short. We literally picked up the phone, called people at 7 other Virginia universities. We got together for sandwiches and little workshops, really rich, great conversations. And then if you remember in 2015, protests erupted at Georgetown University related both to Black Lives Matter and to the 1838 sale of 272 people. They reached out to me. I went up. We did a teach-in, and I spent the day at Georgetown going, wait a minute, why is this just Virginia schools? Everybody should be doing this. So we reframed it, cut off the VC, and just made it University Studying Slavery. And within 2 years, it was University Studying Slavery and Racism. We didn't change the name. Bad acronym. But really important, it's 100 schools in 6 countries now. It has understandably, right, it started deeply in the South, but it now includes schools across the Northeast. We're starting to cross the Mississippi. We're in 3 countries in the British Isles, and now have a foothold in South America, because, right, this is at a minimum a 4-continent Atlantic story that we're looking at. It's not just about what's happening at those individual institutions. So the idea was to create a movement, and I'm at least, we're at a moment now where I can say I think we've actually achieved that. I don't know that I anticipated that it would be 100 schools 6 years later.
Yes. And I will say that's the only reason we exist, is because other schools do it first. So one of the ones I think it sounds silly now, but I think there's, when you start these projects, there's like a burden of proof, particularly for white people. They want to know, was it really that bad? Was it that bad? And I was worried about that. I was worried about, like, were we going to be able to find this burden of proof that our primarily white campus wanted to see? I was vindicated in the first couple months when our researchers, we had to put a stop on searching for blackface and minstrelsy photos because we found too much. It became a bottomless pit, quite frankly, a research pit that we just made a decision that if we found 100 more photos, it wasn't going to tell us anything we didn't already know. The students loved doing blackface and minstrelsy on campus. And so when we found that, it became, I mean, now it's obvious, but it was bad. We had enough where we should have been doing this project decades ago. One of the things I think that shaped the project in a way that was difficult was this kind of one-shot mentality. So it was very clear when I was hired and when I started that everywhere I went, this project will not be continuing. You have 3 years, then 4 with the pandemic. You have one shot at this. So do what you need to do, and then you will be packing up your office and you will be leaving. And that really affected so much. I mean, it was really difficult. We couldn't always do the things that we wanted to do. I think if you go to our website, reckoning.wis.edu, you'll see that it's like packed to the brim with information in a way that I don't think is always pedagogically great. I think it can be really overwhelming for folks. But we had this mentality of, well, if we don't tell this story now, will it ever get told? Will it ever get researched again? And will it ever get the attention it deserves? And if we answered that and we said, no, it'll never get talked about, we put it on the website. We added it, even if it meant that it was hard to navigate or if it was overwhelming. And so that really affected so much of the project. And if we would have known that they were going to give us a center and that we'd have, lots of time to do more work, I think we could have done it differently, right? We could have taken more time with certain topics. We could have made them more thematically arranged. It wouldn't have maybe been as overwhelming as it is right now. And so part of our goal now that we know we have more time is to step back and figure out how can we make this so that it is educationally, pedagogically, culturally what it needs to be to change our campus. And so time has given us that. But in the outset, that scarcity mentality, that one-shot mentality kind of haunted the project. And it also, I think, affected the kind of collaborations we could build. Because, for the past year or two, there's been community partners who've said, hey, we want to build out this program, or we want to do this class, or we want to do this thing. And I would say, okay, well, I can help you until July of 2023. And then my contract ends. And then I don't know if we're going to be here. And now when these people approach us, we can make these partnerships. We can invest in the next 5, 10, 15 years because the center will be here. But it did affect, I think, and limit some of the opportunities that we had. I will say I'm a little bit of a rebel. So when people, obviously, I think you have to be a little bit of a rebel to do this work. When people told me, oh, they're never going to continue this project, I was like, I'm going to make the work so essential to the university and to faculty and staff and students that you will be ridiculed, you will be mocked, you will be vilified if you as administrators cancel this work. And that's what happened. We just made everybody love it so much. And they can't think of a university without it. But I didn't imagine that it would. Our community really did come out this last fall. There was a big letter writing campaign to continue the project. All of our shared governance committees passed unanimous resolutions to continue the project. Without all of that energy and that community buy-in, we would not be here. And so it was something that I think we didn't know if it would work out this way, but I'm really happy that it did. And now I think, not only do we get to sit on panels like this and kind of, we're newer in the legacy, but I'm really happy that we get to kind of, hopefully now Michigan can be like, hey, this work should maybe be permanent, that we can kind of continue this legacy, because I think every university will have to do this. It's just a matter of when they will do it.
So I think the most surprising thing when we began this work at Harvard, for me, personally and professionally, was once the Peabody Museum had begun its survey of its holdings, and the discovery was made that there were at least 19 individuals who were probably or likely to have been enslaved at the time we acquired them. It was the phone call from the president's chief of staff saying, tomorrow the president is going to ask you to chair the university-wide committee on human remains in Harvard Museum collections. And I was like, well, that's going to stand out on my resume. Wow, that's a big one.
Another title,
but that was a really big one. And the sort of moral weight that raised for me was what was absolutely the most surprising thing. I think there were some within our museum committee who knew that we had a number of human remains, most of them, and the largest number being of indigenous peoples from around the world. And the ways in which the NAGPRA, that is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, had been enforced at Harvard, there were people who knew that we had these remains of indigenous peoples, and that there were already regulations in place for, return and repatriation of funerary objects and those remains. But it was not well known at all that we had remains of people who had been formerly enslaved. And so that, I think, was one of the biggest shocks for us, as well as the fact that we didn't have any structures in place for dealing with those individuals. No accountability, no reporting relationships, no committees to evaluate how we might repatriate them or rebury them or reach out to descendant communities. We had none of that in place. And so I think that was one of the most remarkable and intense things that nobody had been expecting. I certainly had not. And again, it reified and brought to the fore that piece that many people in the Harvard community believe, that Harvard just didn't have that big of an impact on any of these things. And so here we are uncovering layer after layer after layer of other connections. And I think that has been significantly important that we start that process. And I really emphasize we're just at the beginning of it, but also the commitment to doing it, and then the commitment to repair. That is, if it involves human remains and repatriations, if it involves establishing relationships with institutions and in other places, say, for example, in the Caribbean, where we know some profits were involved in supporting Harvard. Does that mean we have to establish relationships with those communities and think about offering educational advantages to to students and people in those communities? What are we going to do? How do we repair? So I think those were some of the things that were really striking and unexpected.
I'll just say one thing. I didn't actually anticipate how cool what we would find in the archives would be. I think part of what was edifying to me about the Brown story was not simply that we were doing it in the present, but was discovering that we were not, as some alleged, projecting our modern values on some past, that we were simply entering a conversation that had been going on in our campus for a very long time. So, among the documentary collections that we found in the Brown archives were over 300 manuscript pages from a singularly murderous slaving voyage, the Sally, which the Brown brothers sent to West Africa the year of the university's founding. So we digitized those. You can see them online, told that story. But we also then had the brothers split over this issue. One of the brothers continued to participate in transatlantic slave trade. 3 of the brothers did not. Moses, in particular, became the founder of the Providence Abolition Society. The first charge, or the first suit in American history for illegal slave trading, is a charge against John Brown brought by his younger brother Moses. That sense that what we were doing was, again, consonant with what a university was. So one other document that had that same effect for me, and this one I'll never forget, it was like late at night. It was like 2 a.m. when I opened it. I was feeling rather beleaguered, but an archivist had said, the students used to talk about this stuff. And I think we have like some commencement addresses. Do you want to see them? So I photocopied them or digitized them and sent them to me. And I was sitting up, and one of them turns out to be, some of you who are American historians will recognize the name, a Brown student in the 1890s named James Talmadge, 1790s, named James Talmadge, who was later the author of the Talmadge Amendment that provokes the Missouri Crisis in 1819, 1820. And you have to imagine the Brown commencement. He's the commencement speaker. And so you've got all these Brown trustees who are sitting there, and we were able to identify 30 members of the Brown Corporation who owned or captained slave ships, most of them illegally. And he steps up there, the student says, I'm going to take as my subject the subject of slavery. And he, in quite satirical ways, trots out the various arguments that have been advanced on behalf of slaving and the slave trade and kind of demolishes them. And then he says, and the last one he brings up is this curious idea, he says, of race, that a person of lighter skin is somehow superior to a person of darker skin. He said, an idea, if taken to its logical conclusion, would make a brown Washington subject to the tiniest albino. But he then says, and I just started to cry, he says, the fact that in this day and age people on this university campus can believe that is a matter for future generations to investigate. And I felt at that moment like a message in a bottle had been tossed into the sea and that had rocked up on my shore. And that was a powerful moment for me. And it was also a moment that confirmed for me that we are also tossing messages in bottles. And we ought to be mindful of that. We ought to be mindful of the fact that people 200 years from now are going to be talking about us. And if this process can make us more reflective about what they might say about us, and more reflective, not simply pointing accusatory fingers at people in the past and patting ourselves on the back for our own superior moral wisdom, but actually thinking more self-reflectively about the way in which we, like they, are complicit in grievous human injustice, then that's something we should also be thinking about.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you about one of the challenges of the scope of our project is how to make good on this project, on this promise of it being a truly inclusive history. And so I wondered if you could speak a little to how you address the needs and concerns and desires of the many and diverse communities that make up your university?
I'll just say one brief thing. Kurt's already said it. Universities turn over every 2 or 3 years. And so you need somehow, we have a notion that we're working in a cumulative way as academics. That's not, so you have to continually work out ways to engage students in particular in this work on a continuous basis.
I think that's part of it, but given that you guys are in the framing phase here, I think really building in an intentional way, a series of, not just yearly activities, but also maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, thinking really hard about what you need to have to sustain community engagement, not repeating the same things over and over about the project, but make the project a kind of living thing. And I think that's one of the struggles or I should say challenges that we've been trying to think about as we go forward with implementation of the recommendations of our report, how to continue to have a robust and real community engagement and projects that will be meaningful to people of Boston and the area, but also how to continuously re-engage our own communities. So we have new curricular projects. I want to make sure that we see that those projects need to be staffed regularly, taught all the time, invigorated by, introduction of new ways of presenting the material. We want this project to be engaged, the staff to be engaged in these projects, and many other people in the community need to understand that if you are in Harvard, this is part of what you have to understand about what Harvard is and was and is trying to be now. And that to me is a practice that if we do, as Jim suggested, our kind of typical way is to kind of, if you just teach the course over and over, that'll be fine. But it's not just that. And we won't get the true cultural change if we only do that. So I think it is figuring out what is the sustainable engagement plan that you want to have to go forward.
Since ours was really broad, from a practical perspective, we tried to figure out which communities we wanted to make sure were documented or which communities were underdocumented. And then I think this is where the public history approach did help, is there was a lot of research that was already done. So there's like a 2-book series written by this incredible local historian named Rich Wagner. And I went to him and said, we're doing this exhibit. We would love to use parts of your book. What stories from your book are most important about the LGBTQ community? Will you help me curate them into this exhibit, right? So then we didn't have to repeat that research. We didn't have to go back into the archive and re-research the gay purges on campus because we had that research. Like, I trust that Dick Wagner is a published historian. I trust that his research is good. And yeah, we could have sent a student in there to redo it. And for what, right? Like, what would we have really gleaned newly that we didn't already know, which is that the university was purging gay men. And so that helped us a lot because then we could swing our focus. So one of the topics that came to us is that we knew that nobody had really researched the history of Japanese students who came to UW after being incarcerated. And so that was wholly new research that we got to invest in because we were happy to use previously published research and, work with those authors to figure out how to put that into an exhibit, how to put that into a website. So that freed us up in that way. I will say the one critique that we get everywhere I go is there's not enough of X. And every time I'm like, you are 100% right. Absolutely. I wish we could tell 100 more stories. And often, we'll kind of talk to people about why that is. So we have a bunch of oral history projects within our project. And like one of them is for Black Greek letter organizations. The Black Greek letter organizations on our campus are really poorly documented in the archive. Really poorly documented. And so we started an oral history project. And, every year we go to Multicultural Homecoming and we meet 5 to 10 new people and they introduce us to 5 to 10 more people. And we have this kind of robust project going on. And so we didn't have as much as we wanted on our website about Black Creek letter orgs, but we're working on it, right? And so often we'll really just be honest with community about the research shortcomings that we're facing, and then try and partner with them, right? Do you know of somebody we could talk to? Is there somebody in the community who holds this history that we can kind of collaborate with? So that has helped. And I think now that we do have more time, we know what those topics are. And all of our topics, I will add, were community curated. So we have an advisory committee that we report to, so they would kind of help steer us and be like, you can't research everything. Why don't we focus on these 3, and then next semester we'll hit that one. But we do a call to action on everything that we do. So all of our blogs, all of our published materials, every event that we do, we ask people, if you think there's a story that we haven't covered, a person that you think is interesting, please email us, please reach out. We have like an anonymous form where people can do that as well. And so the community, told us what to research often and gave us those kind of leads that we needed.
I'll just start with, we've all used the word community a lot. And Kacie, I like that you said communities. I think the first thing you have to do is complicate the notion of what do you mean by community? Be very clear there. And then 2 is you identify the various communities you want to hear from, meet them where they are. So as an example, it's very easy to create an online survey and get pretty good feedback from students. That's not going to work with your local community, right? You're going to have to go out into the community, go to churches, go to community centers. That's hard work. I think in addition to doing that, and this speaks to, we did events with staff. You have to buy them release time so that you're not asking them to come after work, right? I don't know how it is here, but in Charlottesville, many of the staff live in neighboring counties, so they've got a 40-minute drive home. They're not going to sit here at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and listen to anything we've asked them to do. So feed them, buy out their time and make it worth their participation in the event. I think you have to do the same thing. We've wrestled with this as a state university. It's a little tricky about how do you compensate the community for their time. So we have done this in ways that include, again, same thing. You serve a meal and there's some other cultural event associated with it. We've also gone out with scanners and scanned family materials, not for our benefit, for their benefit, to get people, to pull people in at these community centers and do them at different times of the day. So I think that's really important to think about. And I love it, Evelyn, you described it as you can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. So you have to keep coming up with new ways to pull the community in and think really strategically about where you're going to meet them to get their feedback. And then last, listen. This is the hardest part. I know I've struggled with it, right? You want to tell them, no, wait, I know the story. No, you don't. They already know. When you go out into the local community, this history that you're now for the first time as an institution kind of embracing and talking about, they're like, yeah, we already knew all this. They need to hear us say it. That's part of the practice. But you have to go out and then do the listening and do your best. It's not perfect. To do things that are in response. It's not just enough that people feel heard. They have to feel like they were heard and you're actually responding to what they wanted. And know that that is really fragile. We struggled, the pandemic hit. We were 5 years into a project and then we had 2 years. You can't do a Zoom community engagement project. They just don't work. And so we lost some momentum because we lost those 2 years. And that, again, nothing we could do there, but you want to think really strategically years out. How are we doing it? Where are we doing it? What are the kinds of things we're going to do? And what are the low-hanging fruit commitment of university resources we can use to provide some basic level of compensation for their time and their input?
We're now at that point. Thank you. We're now at that point where I invite anyone who has a question to come to. I can see the mic on my left. I can't tell from the podium if there's a mic on the right hand side. If not, there's the one over here to our left to come forward. We do have a few questions that have come via email or electronically, and they cluster around the question of the seeming invisibility so far in our conversations of Indigenous people. And the ways in which campuses that particularly started with a conversation about slavery did not include Indigenous folks in the story of slavery. And I don't know how you thought about that as you were doing your work.
Yeah, it did come up at Brown. You know, the particular kind of entry point for us was the participation of the robust and indeed dominant participation of Rhode Islanders including many benefactors in the transatlantic slave trade. But we also did a series of programs about indigenous slavery. In fact, we had some interesting descendant groups of one of the first enslaved people who are actually trafficked into New England are actually trafficked in exchange with in the Caribbean with captives from King Philip's War, right? So they actually traffic indigenous people and exchange them for African descent enslaved people. And we actually got some descendant communities from there. I think the interesting one for this is going to be Stanford University, which where I teach now, which sits on the old Stanford Farm, which before it was a Stanford Farm was a Muwekma Ohlone village on land that is still never, unlike the University of Michigan land, been formally ceded. So there are a number of universities that are beginning to turn to this work. Oddly enough, Northwestern University did a very interesting project related to this. You can see their report. But I think that the point's absolutely correct. If we're going to start talking about grievous historical injustice and what responsibilities befall us in the present in light of those, I couldn't agree more. We haven't talked enough about it today.
No, we're very aware that the connections between what happened with indigenous people in the state of Massachusetts from its very founding to many, many decades later. It's really important part of the story. We had a particular charge, but we were always mindful that there was going to have to be more work done with respect to the history of indigenous folks in the state of Massachusetts and the surrounding areas. We have now, really put more resources into our Native American Studies program, more faculty, more focus on activities that draw the community's attention to this history as well. And we really are committed to doing, as we plan educational projects, to include the intersections of those histories and context and how important they are. Because just as many people in the state of Massachusetts have, despite the name of the state of Massachusetts, have very little sense of what that history is. And as historians know, there are many connections and there are many differences, and it's important to have a certain kind of specificity. We have an active program as a result of our compliance with NACRA of repatriating remains as well as other objects that we have in our extensive collections in the Peabody Museum back to Native tribes who have requested those objects and individuals.
Thank you. With that, we're going to turn to some of the questions that we have from the audience. And I see at the mic to my left, Xiomara. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Xiomara Santamarina, and I'm faculty here in the Department of Afro-American African Studies and English for the past 22 years. I've been fortunate to be teaching African-American literature during this time when this movement of recognition has been evolving. And I was really interested in reading the Brown Report when it came out, because at that time, the issue of reparations was kind of critical. And my question is going to be addressing that issue in particular. I guess one of the things that I find so heartening about all this is that I guess the backlash makes it clear that, like in Florida, that we are having some success in terms of, raising awareness of all this. And so maybe this is a politically untimely question to ask, which is, when we use the word confronting, and it was important to talk about the relationship of the past to the present, right? when we're confronting, I mean, that's a kind of open term. Memorialization is obviously key. Changing the local landscape, for example, as we said in Virginia, we have all these local instances, right? And I'm glad to hear that there's, consolidation of different groups, because if the history of Brown and UVA teach us anything, is that this is a national, this is a national history. It's not just a local history. And the idea of the slave trade, right, as having been something, the first 12 presidents of the United States being slave owners, this is something that isn't just linked to one set of institutions, right? But is memorialization enough? Is it like a land acknowledgement where, there's debates about it? They are now kind of pro forma. Do they actually really do something? Memorialization, bringing the community into the issues. I'm a Georgetown alum, so I was into the whole Georgetown Memory Project when it occurred. What about reparations? Is this our reparation? Is changing the local landscape a form of reparation? And I'm thinking about the present. And one of the things that I read in the Brown report about reparations that really struck me was, well, the problem with just focusing on slavery as something to repair is that it doesn't take into account the fair housing discrimination. It doesn't take into account the discrimination that happened in the 20th century, the discrimination that happens in the 21st century. So is that the reason that the word reparations is kind of dropped out of this? Dropped out? Because I know there are people still interested in reparations. Is it the fact that it's just too much of a political bomb, to talk about it, given that we're on the back foot now? If you're in Florida, I can't teach what I teach if I live in Florida. So I guess that's my question to you. Is memorialization enough of a confronting?
I think the starting point is that every single form of retrospective redress is grossly inadequate, deficient, trivial compared to the atrocities that give rise to it. So I think, there's just a certain spirit of humility that nothing we are going to do, nothing we can do. I think, one of the things that I found was quite interesting was the word reparations was, as you said, a bomb. It was in some ways more a bomb in those early 2000s when these lawsuits were still pending, even than it is today. But what was fascinating to me was everybody assumed that word just meant somebody's writing a check to someone else. And what happens then is, how much is Brown's endowment and how much, if you divide that, if that's your numerator, how big is the denominator of the number of people? And my ancestors came from Italy in 1890, therefore, and all of these kind of really not very profitable conversations, in my opinion. One of the things that was very interesting to me was if I use the word repair, which is absolutely means exactly the same thing as reparation. It opened a door for people to begin to think about this. And I actually believe, monetary reparations are one form of repair that in certain contexts has been used with great effectiveness, but they are only one form. I do think memorials represent a form of a repair. I think integrating into truth-telling is a form of repair, integrating previously neglected histories into our curriculum. An apology seemed like a trivial form of repair, but I promise you, if you've ever felt somebody owed you one and you didn't get it, it didn't feel so trivial at all, right? And so what we tried to do in the Brown report, a lot of the report was actually designed to a lot of our program, the way Ruth framed our program was, yes, tell the truth about Brown and disclose these facts, but organize public programs, and she suggested South Africa, Japanese American internment, Korean comfort women. She just threw out all of these things that will help a society think about What are the available forms of redress? Where have they been used? Where have they been used successfully? Where might they be appropriate? And what happens if you don't do them? And what we really tried to create in that Brown report, in the second 2/3 of it, it's a user's manual. Here's what we learned from having over 100 speakers come on our campus about all these other experiences that things that have worked and not worked in other kinds of societies, what the possibilities of different forms of redress, including monetary reparations, are. And what we then tried to model in our recommendations was what we thought, based on that, what we had learned was appropriate in our case. Our operative point here was that we were operating from the perspective of a university, and so that the forms of repair that we were capable of delivering would grow out of our mission as a university, as universities that are centers for the production, dissemination, and sharing of knowledge. And so, do I think, therefore, that what we recommend, you can again read the report and see, and you can also see what's been accomplished. Are those adequate? No, they're grievously inadequate. But so.
Well, I think it's a really important question. And I think right now it should be the important question. And so I think for us, and I'm speaking here as an individual, there are many views on this particular point on our committee, within our community, et cetera. But the way Dean Brown-Nagin put it is, quote, "We cannot dismantle what we do not understand. And we cannot understand the contemporary injustice we face unless we reckon honestly with our history." And so I think the questioning memorialization is right, but we do still I don't think we can jump over the history and the confronting of that history and our entanglements with that history to really then say we're going to, as a society now or as an institution, we're now ready to reckon with memorialization. I think we've got to go through it. We call this the first phase of our efforts. It's going to take time for us to get through it and get through it in a way that's honest and intentional and robust and not just sort of, throwing around buzzwords to everybody. And if you don't get the right buzzword of the week, you're a bad person, any of that kind of stuff. I think it is the real confrontation of the entanglements of our institution in this history. And I just keep trying to say to people, it's not simple. It takes time and energy and effort and commitment. James and I were talking about earlier today, how many of you were here on a Friday afternoon? I really would not want to bet on how many people I can get at my institution to be here for this conversation on Friday afternoon.
We wouldn't draw flies.
So that means that many people here are ready to engage. So I want to focus on, I have real questions about memorialization. I'm engaged in a project right now where I'm traveling around the world and looking at various ways these kinds of issues. Apartheid has been memorialized, and the resistance to apartheid being memorialized. In Germany and the Holocaust, how is that memorialized? What are people doing? And you see these are engagement projects, right? And so I don't think we are necessarily there yet, because we're still wrestling with the fact that, gee, really, there were slaves in Massachusetts,
Rhode Island, too.
in Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania, and everywhere around us. There really were there. We haven't even gotten deep into that question. Much less are we ready to then think about the deepest aspect of repair and memory that we will have to do if we want. There's one approach anybody can take, and I think many of us would reject it. There's a top-down view. Okay. President Babcock could have said, "Go build a memorial to this. You guys know enough. Go fix it." That we might have made something meaningful in some ways, and we probably would not. Right? It should be the community having the conversation, enough information out there. I don't mean information. I mean an understanding of history, which is not simply information being dispensed, that would allow people from a really meaningful place to say, what is this institution? What has it been? And as Dean Nagin said, if you don't understand it, you cannot dismantle. Mm-hmm. the things that brought us to the fact that we have in our care remains of individuals without their consent, or that we have individuals in this university who were proponents of scientific racism. We have, so how do we get there? How do we untangle these things, understand them, and understand the ways in which they trip us up now, so that our children will be looking back at us and going, oh yeah, so how come you guys let that happen? And where was the responsibility? And whose job was it? And as my son is wont to say, oh yeah, Mom, did you say anything about that? And I want to be able to say, yes, I did. Yes, I did. So I think it's absolutely a central question. How do we get through it to have a complex and answer that is meaningful for our entire communities is not a simple story.
I'm just going to quickly add, you have to think about, right, the research and acknowledgement piece, the truth-telling, as the beginning. Memorialization's also the beginning, right? It's easy at institutions for when you do the memorial, you pat yourself on the back and you go home. But that's actually the foundation for what comes next. So at UVA, the memorial, because it was designed through this community engaged process, opened a door. We have a descendant group that has formed a 501c3 and is working on a memorandum of understanding with the university. We meet with them regularly. They're now called in to really, look over anything we're going to do when we talk about this. It's changed the relationship. And you're also often laying the groundwork for other projects that are going to sprout up at a big university. So at UVA, we don't draw a bright line. We don't use the word repair, but we have a democracy initiative and an equity center that's doing community engaged projects looking at healthcare disparities, housing inequality, and educational inequality in our region. That it's not that there's a direct line between my work on the commission and that, but they're not unrelated. That right, when doing the initial hard work of talking about it gets people to the point where you can find the space for those other projects to launch. So I look back, we did a film in 2014 and we end with it just going, this is just the beginning, watch us. And here I am in 2023. Wow. It's still just the beginning.
I think your question is the important one though, which is that we get stuck, especially because it's a higher education institution. We get stuck in the well, we're just listening and learning right now. We're just learning. This is education. We're just in this educational step. And then it's really easy that you're just in the educational step for decades because we're all just learning still. And so I think that this question, is this reparations? Is this repair? Is the question you almost have to ask yourself all the time so that you're always pushing it past the educational part. We have not used the word reparation a lot or repair a lot because we have there's a lot of panic at our institution about that word. But we use the word reckoning a lot. Reckoning's become kind of the core of our project. And it's a word that I think a lot about. But I think that you the quotes that you can't get to repair without that reckoning moment. But my thing is reckoning is also an action too. It is an active process, just as repair is an active process. So often, I'll talk to people about reckoning and I'm like, just because you came to the exhibit and learned something new, have you actually reckoned with it? Have you actually done the work that you need to do, not only as an individual, but in your department or unit, in your classroom, in your community? Reckoning is also not just learning, right? And so I think that question is actually really important as a kind of reminder that the work is almost not ever done.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. And would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you all. This has been a great discussion. I'm Gary Krenz. I direct the University's Historic Detroit Observatory, which, despite the name, is actually here in Ann Arbor. We do programming around university history and the tensions in that history. So I have a couple of practical questions, I guess. I wondered if you could speak to engagement with alumni, which can be a group that is kind of distributed, difficult to reach, except for a certain maybe self-selective cohort. And also specifically maybe for Professor von Becke, but others, a little bit more about using the built environment and engaging the built environment in the work that you're doing. Thank you.
I'll just say quickly on alumni, we were told that alumni would hate this project, that the Alumni Association would hate this project. And so I made a real effort to work with the Alumni Association to figure out how this could benefit them. Because I do think everybody can benefit from these types of projects. And what we found is that alumni, including alumni you wouldn't expect, were actually really open to this project. Even alumni who were very like, you rah rah, we love Wisconsin. They said to us, we liked learning new things about UW. It was interesting to hear new stories. We hear the same stories all the time. Oh, we invented vitamin D. That's great. But like, you know, like that, what next, right? And so I think it was actually surprising how much alumni were really invested. I will say, like, to reach alumni, we not only used the alumni magazine quite a bit, and we usually got like tons of emails from that, but we were also in like their newsletter. We would go to every alumni event that we could go to. Like homecoming week is crazy for us. We block our calendars because we're at every alumni event. And just showing up to show alumni that we're there helped a lot. And then asking alumni to do the work too, right? If you like this project, if you like this work, please tell your other alumni about it. Please spread the word for us. And we do have like specifically focused groups for like, you know, African-American alumni, APITA alumni. And those ended up being some of our strongest partners.
Oh boy, I'd give the same response to engagement with alumni. I've been doing it for a decade, and you're right, there's some self-selection, right? If we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson's views on race, some people might decide not to show up, but overwhelmingly positive response from most alumni. Most of the negative stories we got were back in the first couple of years when it was usually on social media, and you could tell by the Twitter handle that you were talking to someone who graduated in the early 1960s when it was nearly an all-white male institution. But really less of that, more of the, oh, this is interesting. Yeah. I didn't know this. I hadn't thought about it this way. So our university worried about it, right? What are alumni going to think? But I think if you're going out and you're laying out the facts and explaining it, it's not a Jeremiad against the institution. This is history. History is complicated. History is messy. They're often more receptive to it than you initially realize. And then I think your second question was about again, this is imperfect. We've tried, if you come to UVA, right, it's literally like an architectural museum to things Jeffersonian. We were even told at one point by someone that the memorial should have been brick with white trim, which was okay. So what we tried to do, and this is the same thing, it's complicated, right? We looked at whenever there was a new building coming online, if it didn't have a name, we ran straight to them and said, here's an opportunity, and tried to do in building naming a little bit more than what you usually do. Like I'm sure here, if you ask students, if you have a dorm and it's named after a former president, and you ask them, you know, who is so-and-so, they'll go, I don't know. Did you see the 8x10 glossy over there with the 3 sentences? So we've named one dorm after an enslaved couple. There's a large lobby installation that tells their story within the story of slavery at the university. There's external panels that do the same. So we've done that. We've worked on been involved in some of the decisions about some of the renaming of buildings, and then looked wherever possible. Okay, somebody wants to put up panels and talk about this. Let's go do it. Let's help them. So dropping that in as many places as possible. And this is a good warning for you as you start this. That works really hard. Right, you immediately, your field of vision narrows every day as you run into all the realities of who's responsible for this space. How do students get access to it? How does the community get access to it? But the goal has been, and we are a long way from it. I wanted it to be impossible for a casual visitor to the university to stroll through the old university and not encounter something that talks about this. So that work is ongoing now, usually kind of quasi-separate. And I think a piece of this is you can't just put up a sign. People stop reading those. They become part of the background. You have to incorporate meaningful rituals every year that bring people to that space. And I struggle with this. My students now always they're like, everything needs to be mandatory and we will indoctrinate everyone and they'll know this history. And I go, sometimes that's not the way. The head is not the only way to reach people. You need to do some work on the heart. And sometimes the way to do that is not through a mandatory class or a module. It's through these other things. So we've worked on
With Charlottesville, we have a thing called, it's now become a week-long Freedom and Liberation Days that usually involves an event that starts at the university and works its way downtown. There are art exhibits and performances. We have an enslaved cemetery that we interpreted, and this has not, I haven't figured out how to make that be an annual event, but we've twice done these really powerful kind of memorial programs there. Those work. Like, students would come out of the adjacent dorm going, what's going on? Why are there 400 people with a candle in the woods? Right? And you connect. And as soon as they get that, they learn a piece of the history. So, but the larger goal has been to do as much of that as possible.
Just one quick thought, and it connects with the previous question about reparations and what the questioner referred to as the kind of climate of backlash that we're living in. And we talked a little bit about this in our remarks with the committee. You know, this is not a particularly propitious political moment to be doing this kind of work, right? When the battle lines in our national politics and partisan political lines are being drawn specifically around this issue, that this is all, I mean, you know, we'll probably be reading about ourselves on Twitter tomorrow, right? That this is all yet more evidence of the kind of insanity and inanity of woke academics and all of these sorts of things. And it's an interesting question, a delicate question, about to what extent do you try to accommodate? Do you try to amend or be responsive to that? It's easy to say, oh, I'm just going to ignore that and speak my truth. But we are also operating not just in a public university, but we're operating as citizens in a democracy in which most people don't necessarily see the world as I do. And I've got to figure out, if they don't, how do I reach them? And I think one way you do that is by not joining in the kind of polarized, you know, resisting the temptations of sanctimony, right, that do infiltrate institutions like those in which we work. And in a sense, joining the polarized political conversation that's being framed for you, right? And I found working with alumni was just an opportunity to do that. You know, they're interested. They care about this institution that I also care about. And so speak softly, listen, nobody, I mean, what I think most people want more than anything else is just that somebody heard them, right? And, so be inclusive, go to these events, invite them, explain what you're doing. If they have concerns, answer them. I had a policy that anybody who wrote me an email, I had two words that if they used, I didn't reply. One began with F and one began with N. But otherwise, I just would reply. And and I would try to reply graciously and say, well, that's an interesting perspective. We don't agree, but we've thought about this, or we're doing this. Why don't you come in? And it was kind of amazing to me how that itself could be really disarming. And it was probably a reminder of what should be best practice for academics in general, right? All the stuff that we're talking about is just, start from the perspective that what might be obvious to us by virtue of our social position or the fact that we've just spent the last year researching this particular aspect of our institution's history is at first glance not intuitive and perhaps threatening to a lot of other people. And some of those people are deliberately producing a kind of polarizing politics, and they're never going to hear you. But I actually think there's a lot of people out there who will. So I would encourage you to just try to reach out and talk with rather than at your alumni body, and I bet they'll surprise you.
Our time is, thank you all. Our time, unfortunately, is about over. And so I look at the clock and I realize we could go for at least another half an hour, not another half a day, talking about this. But please join me in thanking our colleagues who... And I also want to thank all of you who are sitting here in person or online who participated. I want to thank our partners in the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, especially John Carson and Greg Parker and Elizabeth Collins, the Technology Services Unit of the College of Literature, Sciences, and the Arts. They've been responsible for running our video and audio services today. The staff members at the Michigan Unions and M Catering, who have been excellent partners in planning today's symposium. And of course, our captioners behind the scenes on Zoom and to our ASL interpreters, Alyssa Grant and Yakata Nichols. Thank you. We also want to acknowledge the financial support from the university, both for the Inclusive History Project and this event, and to say indeed that this is the beginning. And when we think of this, we imagine a multi-year endeavor. In a minimum of 5 years, could be 10, and meaning that others will be sitting in these chairs working on it, because this will be our collective effort. And the question about reparations, and as some in this room know, I've spent the last 5 years teaching courses on reparations and history and policy in the United States, and doing so at the moment. But it reminds me, when we think of reparations, it's really, one part of that is acknowledgement. Yeah. Another part of that is both redress, which can be restitution, but also apology. And another part of that is reckoning. And so there are these different concepts and models out there, but how we begin to think about what inclusive history means here at the University of Michigan means that we won't be able to sidestep the question of repair and reparations. And in fact, it would be at the heart of what we will be doing. And I'll say this just as an aside, not connected to inclusive history, but it will have the University of Michigan's name on it. We're actually producing a PBS documentary on race and history and reparations that will air this coming fall as part of a project I'm overseeing elsewhere at the university. And so all of this gets linked. And so in today's world of politics, you remind yourself every morning when you get up, this is all worth doing. And so thank you for including us in the work that is worth doing.